be talking today about our work this past year in figuring out what the state of whole farm phosphorus balance was in Virginia. To introduce the concept of nutrient balances, consider this simplified livestock system in which nutrients come in through primarily feed, really, about 70% or so, perhaps some fertilizer bedding, and then nutrients come off the farm through crops sold, animals sold, manure, obviously in a dairy system, milk being sold. And a whole farm mass balance doesn't really consider environmental losses or internal cycling so much, just really trying to balance what comes in, what goes out. As a result, more nutrients in an animal agriculture system typically come in than leave, and so you end up with a positive mass balance. This is pretty evident here when we look at the soil test phosphorus levels throughout the counties in Virginia. Can you tell where the animal agriculture is? We have here a couple of counties that have most of the dairy farms in Virginia, and they all pretty much have a high number of farms that have excessively high soil test phosphorus from years and even decades of high phosphorus balances. And that's just kind of the nature with animal agriculture. So we wanted to look into how we might improve upon these farms and figure out what their phosphorus balance was. And so we of course looked to the work that's been done nearby in New York at Cornell. And I want to walk you through this figure, spend a little time on it, because I've fashioned my own figures later after this manner. And so what we have here is on the y-axis phosphorus balance, right? The difference between imports and exports gives you your phosphorus balance, and so anything above 0 then would represent more imports. Anything below 0 would represent more exports. And they decided to put it in terms of milk production because that's a good way to communicate with dairy farmers. Talk about how much milk is being produced. All of this is normalized on a per acre basis to better compare different size farms with different land base. And we see there's a spread from hundreds of farms over the years that operate all around with different phosphorus balances, different milk production levels. And so below this line at 0, having a phosphorus balance below that for years will draw down your soil phosphorus, which might actually be favorable in some of our farms in Virginia, in the short term at least. And then at some point though, you have to say what is too much of a phosphorus balance. And so they decided to set their limit such that 75% of the farms could achieve it. It's very flexible and very feasible. There's also a diagonal line here that represents how much phosphorus is coming in given how much milk is being produced. And where these regions overlap, the yellow and the blue, you get this sort of optimal green region in which you limit your phosphorus accumulation and you also are producing milk efficiently in terms of the phosphorus balance. Not only is this useful on an annual basis, but if you repeat it over the years, you can begin to track farms, such as this one here that's showed by the colored dots, with a downward trend in phosphorus balance over time. So knowing the state of your phosphorus balance allows you to make management changes on the farm. And we wanted to see what that might look like for Virginia. But there are differences between New York and Virginia. For instance, here's a dairy farm. Dairy on the right, poultry houses on the left. There's more overlap in Virginia with poultry production. There might be differences in feedstuffs, such as access to dry distillers grains or wet brewers grains. That might be different from New York. Differences in soils, climate, cropping, land bases. We wanted to figure out kind of where we stood compared to the strong data sets available in New York. And so our objectives then this past year was to determine the state of phosphorus balance, including primarily dairies that are within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And also in making sure that we are able to include small unregulated dairies, helping them achieve better phosphorus balance voluntarily without needing future regulation for having high soil test phosphorus. We also looked to explore potential risk factors for those 25% of farms that do fall above the phosphorus balance threshold. To see perhaps our risk factors would be similar to New York, or they might be unique. So we wanted to look in particular, and this is what I'll be presenting today, looking at how poultry litter applications affect phosphorus balance, how the phosphorus that comes through imported feed on a per animal unit, how dry distillers grains, those farms that choose to have feedstuffs like dry distillers grains, which is concentrated in terms of its phosphorus content, compared to the rest of the total mixed ration. Maybe there's a difference between organic farms. Maybe there's at some point, the animal density in Virginia, having too many animals on your land will affect phosphorus balance. So those are some things we wanted to look at, and so we began going out. It wasn't a random sample. We just wanted to get any and all farms that would listen and voluntarily participate in this non-mandatory survey. And so we collected these characteristics, as well as obviously farm imports and exports, manageable imports and exports, to begin calculating phosphorus balance. And sometimes we would have to collect our own samples, whether it was bedding like sawdust or peanut hulls to different feed, and we got some kelp there. We did some of our own analysis, or if the farmer didn't have the record, sometimes we would, or a sample for us, we could just pull from the Dairy One database. In terms of our results, I just wanted to put this up here to compare what was published from New York from their 2006 survey, to kind of show how our median typical farm compared to their median or typical farm. Again, we only had 44 farms, and they tended to be smaller, but in terms of number of cows in the land. But we did produce more kilograms of milk per cow per year, so take that. Just kidding. It's just differences in sampling, right? But do notice that our animal density is a little bit higher. Our phosphorus balance tended to be higher, though the phosphorus use efficiency, at least in terms of milk production, seemed to be a bit lower in these 44 farms. So, like I said, here's our data for the 44 farms in Virginia this past 2017, done after the manner of the Cornell plot. And so we have a region in which farms are below, they're negative in their P balance, in the soil P drawdown zone. We also have some farms that are considerably higher. There's that pair of farms up there near the top that are kind of off the charts. And our feasibility limit at that 75% for phosphorus balance ended up being closer to 18 kilograms per hectare, rather than the 13 kilograms per hectare from New York. So when we start looking at some of the farms, I noticed these two both produce the same amount of milk per hectare, but they have vastly different phosphorus balances. When we get into looking at some of these reasons as to why they might have a different phosphorus balance, we notice that first, on the dairy side of things, they have the same land base, the same milk produced in cows. But when it comes to some of these other factors, Farm A at the top imports twice as much phosphorus through its feed, per head or per animal unit than does Farm B at the bottom. They also were unable to export any manure, export any crops. Both farms have chickens, but Farm A not only has twice as many chickens, but didn't export any of their litter. So for 2017 at least, they had a much higher phosphorus balance. I want to show you now what this kind of looks like for the rest of the farms. When we look at which farms applied poultry litter, they either bought it as a fertilizer, a nitrogen fertilizer, or they were generating it from their poultry houses and using it on their land. We see the spread here. About half of them ended up with a phosphorus balance above that feasibility limit, suggesting that there is some risk involved in using poultry litter. Others were below that, suggesting that when they did use poultry litter, maybe they were exporting phosphorus through other ways, like crops being sold and such. Here we can see what the phosphorus balance distribution looks like in terms of feed imported phosphorus. In other words, this is phosphorus in the balance that's coming in through feed. Either they're buying more feed or the feed is just more concentrated in phosphorus. And these, on this graph, most of the farms that are around 9 to 10 kilograms and above in terms of phosphorus coming in per animal unit tend to be at or above the phosphorus balance threshold, suggesting that that is something to be monitored and watched for. When we look at those farms that used high feed or high phosphorus concentrates or feed additives like dry distillers grains, picture wasn't as clear. There are some farms that use it and had a lower phosphorus balance, even an optimal phosphorus balance, but there were also some that were above the feasibility limit. We only had 3 organic farms out of the 44, and they all had phosphorus balances below the 18 kilograms per hectare. But I think part of that is that organic dairy farms do operate, at least in Virginia, on a larger land base, having to graze their cows more. So with more land, on a per hectare basis, your phosphorus balance comes down a bit. And then lastly, I wanted to show what we saw in terms of animal density, animal units per hectare. When you start looking at 1 animal unit per acre or 2.4 animal units per hectare, above that, it's quite widely spread in Virginia. There's plenty of farms with high animal densities that are operating in that optimal green zone or below it even. And so animal density, at least at first look, doesn't seem to be a risk factor in the way it was in New York, but perhaps we're not looking at it the right way. So to summarize, from again our first look here at these 44 farms, it seems like poultry litter applications are an easy way to throw off your phosphorus balance if you're not doing anything else. The amount and phosphorus concentration of purchased feed matter, though animal density and organic milk production didn't seem to be as risky. Now going forward, again, I think one of the useful tools for phosphorus balance is repeating it over the years, right? I mean, if a farm in Virginia uses poultry litter one year and then doesn't use it the next year, their phosphorus balance is probably going to fluctuate quite a bit. And so to go back and survey these farms again next year would be quite advantageous in that you start to see a rolling average on where these farms are operating. Another important thing to consider too is what is the cost. If you're going to give up something like dry distillers grain, then what other feed are you going to produce or buy to feed your cows? Is there any cost involved in that? But I'd like to acknowledge the Virginia dairy farmers that voluntarily participated in our study, though they did get a free hoodie and the funding from the NFWF. And with that, I'll take any questions.
We probably have time for one question, if anybody has one for Austin. Yeah.
So with respect to the animal density, what's the potential explanation? Were they exporting a lot of manure? How did they keep the balance low yet have high animal density?
Yeah, going back to this, a lot of the farms that you see here that had high animal density and negative feed balances, they were farms that were not only exporting manure but also exporting crops. There was quite a few of the smaller farms that tend to be towards the lower end didn't tend to export crops as much, and I think that's just the nature of the smaller unregulated farms there. Yeah. Any other questions?
All right.